everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another deep deck dive, this time with Amulet Titan in Modern. As a friendly reminder, if you like these informative Modern videos, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. Full disclaimer, I am not an Amulet Titan pilot, but I will do my best to explain the deck. There's a lot of nuance with this deck, so if I miss on something I do apologize, but I will try to fill in the blanks as best as I can. So Amulet Titan is a generally mono green, splashing all the other colors for different things, ramp deck in the Modern format that tries to get a Primeval Titan into play and do very broken things with it from there. This is a deck that comes in different flavors and different things, but the core of the deck is four copies of Primeval Titan, which allows you to search for 2 lands when it enters the battlefield. 4 copies of Dryad of the Elysian Grove, which turn all your lands into all basic land types. It's a 2/4 enchantment that also allows you to play additional lands each turn. And then obviously the namesake card, Amulet of Vigor. Whenever a permanent enters the battlefield tapped, under your control, you untap it. This is used to abuse the bounce lands in the Modern format that are from the original Ravnica block. Previously, there was a card named Summerbloom that allowed you to play 3 additional land drops each turn, which would enable turn 2 Titans. Much like a lot of decks that have survived over time, Amulet is a deck that's survived through multiple bans. It's suffered the ban of Summerbloom, suffered the ban of Field of the Dead, among several other auxiliary pieces that have been banned over time. But those are the 2 ones that have forced the biggest changes to the deck. The other cards that have forced changes to the deck are, obviously we've talked about Dryad of the Elysian Grove, but another new one is Urza's Saga, which makes finding the namesake Amulet much easier. Much like it makes finding Colossus Hammer a lot easier for Hammer Time, it also makes finding Amulet easier for this deck. Beyond that, you're just a ramp deck trying to play land drops. You're using things like Arboreal Grazer and Explorer, along with a card Azusa Lost But Seeking, which used to be a much wider played in this deck than it is now because of the addition of Dryad just being so much better than the deck's game plan. But Azusa allows you to play 2 additional lands each turn. Explorer allows you to play an additional land the turn you play the spell, as well as draw a card. And then Arboreal Grazer allows you to ramp a little bit earlier and can be quite an important thing on your Amulet turns with your bounce lands. The other part of the equation in this deck is all of the various bounce lands you're playing, the biggest one being Simic Growth Chamber, as this enables you to kind of cheat on mana. Most decks in Modern produce 1 land, however, most of these bounce lands produce 2. The downside of them returning lands to your hand is offset by the ability of Amulet of Vigor to untap them, so you can stack the triggers to where the land untaps, and then the land bounces back to your hand, so you can get 2 mana produced each time. Sometimes this allows 1 bounce land in your hand turn into multiple land mana with Amulet and some type of multiple land drops, whether it be Azusa, Dryad, Explorer, Arboreal Grazer, to allow you to get ahead on mana, oftentimes leading to explosive turns to allow you to play your Primeval Titan ahead of turn 4, turn 5. Beyond that, you're playing mostly green bounce lands with the Simic Growth Chamber, Roll Turf, as well as sometimes versions of Selesnya Sanctuary here. One of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later on is the breakdown of the haste lands in the deck, but the main one in this version is playing Slayer's Stronghold, which you play with Boros Garrison whenever you get your Primeval Titan to give the Titan haste when you have an Amulet in play, and then if you have a copy of Asuva in your deck, you then copy Boros Garrison, play Sunhome Fortress of the Legion. This allows you to give your Titan double strike, which used to be one of the primary ways this deck would win. It would get an Amulet or 2 into play, cast a Primeval Titan, give it haste, give it double strike, deal your opponent 16 or 20 damage out of nowhere, depending on how many Amulets that were in play. Nowadays, it has a secondary game plan that mostly revolves around Dryad of the Elysian Groves and Valakut the Mountain Pinnacle. Valakut, whenever a mountain enters the battlefield, if you control 6 or more mountains, deals 3 damage to any target, while with Dryad in play, every single land you have in play becomes a mountain, therefore allowing your Valakuts to trigger with just 6 land drops and not having to play a single basic mountain or mountain of any type in the deck other than Dryad enabling those things. Beyond that, you play a variety of Utility lands, Bojuka Bog for any type of graveyard nuking, whether it be against decks like Dredge, Living End, Murktide, those kind of decks. Boseiju Who Endures is a more recent addition to the deck. This is something you can tutor up to deal with some of the more problematic things for the deck, things like Blood Moon and Dive Down, although opponents have adopted tech to get around that we'll talk about later. Cavernous Soul is very important against any kind of counterspell based matchups, so mainly Murktide and control decks, 4-color control, etc. Radiant Fountain is a land you play against the aggressive decks, primarily burn in the format now, but can be relevant in other situations where your opponent's pressuring your life total. Then we've already talked about Slayer, Stronghold, and Sunhome that you pair with your Boros Garrison, which kind of becomes this 3-land package that you have to play in this version of the deck that you don't necessarily have to in other versions. Urza Saga, recent addition, obviously very important to be able to get your copies of Amulet of Vigor into play much more easily, as previously you'd have to dig for it with different things like Ancient Stirrings and such. Now you just get a virtual 4 more copies of the thing. Expedition Map allows you to find any lands you might need, whether it be Teleria West to transmute up for other different things, or just any other bounce land or whatever that you might need. This is one thing you will get off of your Urza Saga if you already happen to have access to Amulet of Vigor. Then Vesuva is kind of the catch-all land. This allows you to kind of get duplicate copies of whatever land you happen to need. Most notably though, when Vesuva comes into play, you can only copy lands that are already into play, so you cannot use it to copy a land that you are having it enter into play, say at the same time with the Primeval Titan. Say if you go get a Valakut and Vesuva, you can't copy the Vesuva because they're both coming into play at the same time. Teleria West is an important card that used to see more play in the deck. Now it's down to 1 or 2 copies depending on the variant you're playing. But this allows you to transmit for any 0 mana play. So any copies of your lands allows you to go get Summoner's Pact, which we'll talk about in a second. Also allows you to get some of your sideboard cards, things like Chalice of the Void or Engineered Explosives, which are cards that often saw play. But beyond that, also can be a grindy mid-range plan with your bounce lands, allowing you to make constructs, then bouncing it before it would be sacrificed. So this can be kind of a grindy value play the deck has gotten in recent times, since the loss of Field of the Dead has become kind of the old Field of the Dead lands. It kind of takes over a lot of what that did, but also giving you more virtual copies of Amulet of Vigor. Another recent addition to the deck is Cultivator Colossus. This is a 7-mana play. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you may put a land from your hand on the battlefield tapped. If you do, draw a card and repeat the process. As you might see with these Amulet lists, they are playing a ton of lands. This is a card that can help you in the grindy matchups, particularly 4-color Omnath, being able to kind of outgrind what they're doing, as oftentimes they can have Solitudes and other things prepared to deal with your primary Titans, so this is kind of your go-over-the-top card in that kind of a matchup. Basically, you can, if you have 2 or 3 lands in play, you can count on drawing 2 or 3 cards, and if you happen to hit any lands off of those, then you can repeat the process. And then it's just a big beater that happens to have trample, which can be very threatening if your opponent can't answer it right away. And that is a look at the main portions of the deck, other than the card, the Summoner's Pact. Summoner's Pact is important as it, much like Urza Saga, giving you extra copies of your Amulet. Summoner's Pact gives you extra copies of Primeval Titan and Dryad, which are your key cards for your various different combo turns or just taking over the game with land value. Another land, Castle Garenbrig, allows you to cast your Titans easier, much like the bounce lands, lets you get ahead on mana and land drops. And then I think that's about it for the land base of this particular list. One card, Turn-Time Mirror Symbiosis, is in this version. This is the non-Karn, the Great Creator variant, which gives you access to more copies of ramp spells, things like Explore, more room to play things like Arboreal Grazer, and room to play things like Turn-Time Mirror Symbiosis. Basically, the non-Karn versions of the deck are more concentrated on getting land drops into play and getting your Primeval Titans into play quicker, as they kind of lack a B substitute mid-range plan that the Karn package offers. The rest of the sideboard in this variant are different bullets for different matchups. Emrakul the Promised End is a go-over-the-top card in kind of the mid-range battles like 4-color Omnath and such, which can be very important in those matchups. Can also be important against things like Tron and such, where you need a card that goes over the top of even what they're doing. 3 copies of Force of Vigor here, and 2 copies of Boseiju, largely targeted against the main hate card of this deck, which is Blood Moon. Blood Moon is a card that can cause you a lot of problems, turns a lot of your utility lands into kind of useless, and forces you to play so many copies of Basic Forest, which can be also a key card in your land base, mainly because one of the hard ways to target this is Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon. Magus of the Moon has been adopted a lot more often because of the fact that it does not get answered by most of the anti-hate cards that decks like this and Tron play, Force of Vigor and Boseiju in particular, and is kind of a counterplay to the counterplay, so to speak. Endurance is tech against a difficult matchup, which can be Living End. Also comes in against things like Dredge if that happens to see play in your local meta. Endurance is a nice way to deal with that. It also kind of gives you a little bit of counterplay against a deck like Mill, which would be a problematic matchup otherwise. Tireless Tracker is much the same way as Cultivator Colossus. It's a card advantage engine against the grindier matchups. Dismember when you need to answer problematic creatures, whether it be Magus of the Moon would be the primary one. When you were playing against humans and stuff and they had Meddling Mage and things, there were different reasons to have Dismember in your sideboard. Relic of Progenitus, once again, Graveyard Hate for a difficult matchup in Living End, and Cavern of Souls because counterspell decks, especially Izzet Murktide and Grixis Death Shadow, can be a difficult matchup. So one of the more long-term additions to the deck has been the addition of Karn the Great Creator. Now, as you can see from the previous version, that does take up a lot of the slots that you would see. Some of your Explorer slots, some of your Arboreal Grazer slots, potentially your Cultivator Colossus slots. The flip side is this gives you access to powerful sideboard hate cards in game number 1 in matchups that can be difficult that we'll talk about when we're talking about some of the sideboard bullets that you have access to. Deck otherwise doesn't change up a whole lot, other than you're a little bit better set up against some of your bad matchups, and you have a little bit more of a mid-range plan when you can't necessarily cobble together your 6 mana for a Primeval Titan. Say you mulligan to 5, makes it a little bit easier to have a valuable threat in those situations. Also increases the value of Arboreal Grazer over a card that used to be played, Sakura Tribe Scout. This is a much easier card to defend against aggressive decks, so against burn and such, this allows you to kind of defend your Karn a little bit easier, when otherwise Karn could be a problematic card in those matchups as you would have a hard time defending it. Once again, land base, not really a whole lot different. One thing to note is Lair of the Hydra, which is a card that's been starting to pop up some lists as kind of a man land to deal with to threaten your opponent with a little bit more aggression. Crumbling Vestige is a kind of pseudo bounce land that, especially if you have an Amulet in play, allows you to get a colored mana and a colorless mana in the same turn. While it's not as powerful as the bounce lands with Amulet, or with Amulet in particular, it is a nice way to have a land that sticks into play with your Valakutes while also getting a little bit of mana or colored mana that you might need. And then beyond that, you're seeing a large portion of Cavern of Souls because Izzet Murktide is ever present. The sideboard that we should talk about with this Karn list is some different bullets that you'll need, but primarily things like Tormod's Crypt for any type of graveyard nonsense. Once again, Living End, Murktide and such. Pithing Needle can shut down problematic cards, different Planeswalkers, Teferi Time Raveler, things like Yawgmoth and such. It's a very nice catch-all to have access to. Liquid Metal Coating allows you to land destruction your opponent into the ground, good against especially other big mana decks or control decks that are very reliant on getting 4, 5, and 6 mana. It can be a nice way to shut down their lands in that regard, start killing their lands with Karn. And then Sky Sovereign is quite nice against any type of creatures or planeswalkers, mowing down your opponent's small creatures or pressuring their planeswalkers in the sky. And then obviously Endurance we've already talked about, Boseiju, Force of Vigor. Cultivator Colossus is in the sideboard of this variant, very good against the grinding matchups, and then some more copies of the various hate cards that you might see. Engineering Explosives is a card that's very good against decks with cheap permanents, although this deck can often get to 3, 4, or 5 different colors, which allow you to blow up a bunch of different things. It can be a catch-all for even things like Blood Moon and such, although a little bit tricky to get to Blood Moon, but 1 and 2 mana permanents, if you need to blow up something along those lines. Chalice of the Void, very good against the various Cascade decks in particular, although it does hit your own Summoners packs, it is something to note. And then Walking Ballista is a nice threat to either have a bunch of mana to pour into, or just being able to deal with your opponent's early creature aggression gives you a threat. Another card that would see some play in some of these Karn variants are things like Crucible Worlds to get back your lands, although that one didn't see as much play, Wormcoil Engine for mid-range matchups, etc. But lists have very much pared down what cards they're bringing in. So another card you could consider, Trinisphere, if you're playing against a bunch of spells decks. Karn gives you access to a lot of things, although as you've seen from this list, maybe not as important as it once was. Still those 3, 4, or 5 bullets can be quite important and swing a lot of matchups that otherwise you'd struggle with. Things like Yawgmoth and stuff. Shutting down the Yawgmoth combo is the main one that comes to mind, but this gives you another mid-range threat. It can be very important in a deck like this that otherwise might have a lot of error. The final variant that I wanted to look at is one that does not involve the card Slayer's Stronghold, Boros Garrison, or Sunhome. Instead, this version decides to play Hinnoir Battlements as its haste land along with Valakut. Basically, the advantage of this version is you don't have to run subpar lands like Boros Garrison. Boros Garrison can really make it difficult to cast your Titan if it happens to be one of the bounce lands you draw. It also makes it more difficult to trigger your Valakuts on a Dryad turn. So Hinnoir Battlements, while it decreases the power of the deck, increases the consistency of the deck. So it's a little bit of a trade-off in that regard. You get to play a little bit better of a mana base at the cost of not having a Vigilant Titan or having the ability to combo kill with a Titan quite as often. You're become a little bit more reliant on the Valakut plan. So there is a trade-off between those. So would you rather have the better mana base in a deck that can already struggle with mana bases because you cannot keep any hands that don't have one? Non-bounce land hands, basically you have to keep a hand that can't be all bounce lands. You have to have something to get the ball rolling with your bounce land starts. Beyond that, you get to play more copies of Castle Garenberg in this version, so it's a little bit easier to cast your Titan a little bit in advance. And then you get a little bit cleaner mana base, and you're not bouncing as many lands on your combo turn with your Valakut, the Molten Pinnacles. And beyond that, all your bounce lands happen to be green-based as opposed to red and white, which do not cast your spells. Once again, this version very clean though, so very nice. Looking at 4 copies of Explorer, 4 copies of Arboreal Grazer, 4 Summoner's Packs. This is a non-Karn version, happens to be running 34 lands. As I've said, this deck is very mana intensive and really takes advantage of all its extra land drops, so that's quite nice. And a lot of times your lands can be found, Teleria West can get you your Summoner's Pack, which Summoner's Pack can get you your various payoffs, whether you need a Dryad or Primeval Titan, or Urza Saga is being able to find your Amulets. Basically, there's almost nothing your lands can't do if you happen to draw a Titan or an Expedition map or whatever, even though this version is skewing a Expedition map as it can be a little bit mana intensive. Other cards I wanted to take a look at, I'm not really sure why the Thornscape Battle Mage is in here, but one of the cards that used to see a lot of play in this deck was Beast Within. It's kind of a catch-all answer against anything, whether it be Magus of the Moon, Blood Moon, Dive Down, Chalice of the Void if you happen to be on a Summoner's Pact hand, etc. This happened to be the catch-all that used to see a lot more play against whatever your opponent was running. The downside is obviously giving your opponent a 3/3 creature, but in a deck that's running 6/6 Tramplers, they don't really care as much about a 3/3 unless they're already under a lot of pressure. Beyond that, you're running 1 copy of Reclamation Sage as a way to Summoner's Pact for something that can deal with problematic enchantments or artifacts, primarily Blood Moon once again. And then beyond that, Tireless Tracker is a nice way to grindy card, especially if you're lacking the Karn package that this version does not happen to be running. Engineer Explosive, Catching All, Dismember for any type of problematic creatures, mainly Magus, and then Bojuka Bog for any type of graveyard nonsense, most notably Living End or Reanimator in the current meta. So where is Amulets placed in the meta? Amulet is one of the more polarizing decks in the format. For a top deck, it has a lot of good matchups and a lot of bad matchups. Whereas a lot of decks like, say, Burn, Blue-Red Murktide, Drix's Death Shadow, etc., are very, very consistent in what they do. Amulet can be a little bit more swingy. The range of hands you have to keep can be a lot more. You're going to be mulliganing a lot more with it, basically. With the addition of Urza Saga, it became a lot easier to find your amulets. You're not playing things like Ancient Stirrings anymore. Oh, that was the other card that was banned from this deck. Once Upon a Time was one of the cards that this deck played back in the day that was very powerful, just being in this free look for lands or look for whatever you needed kind of thing. But, overall, power of this deck is very high, but like I said, it has very polarizing matchups. It's good matchups. It's very good against decks like Burn. It's good against things like Hammer Time. It's decent against the grindy mid-range decks. They can disrupt what you're doing. Depends on the tools that they have. If they're a Blood Moon deck or they happen to have access to Dive Down, this deck can get a lot worse. If they have land disruption, things like Spreading Seas can cause problems. Obviously, namesake Blood Moon. Field of Ruin used to be a bit of a tricky issue. The Leonin Arbiter decks could be problematic. There was a lot of different things that you would see play that would really cause Amulet to have fits. Nowadays, its biggest enemy is counterspells. Mainly Izzet Murktide and Death Shadow, both of which back it up with a ton of pressure. That's why you're seeing so many copies of Caverns of Souls in this deck, is the fact that, the card Counterspell, countering your 6-mana Titan after you Summoner's Pact for it would be very problematic. So, this is a deck that struggles against the Counterspell plus pressure decks, has interesting games against the control decks as it becomes this kind of back and forth, and it becomes more about like finding enough copies of your Titan to run your opponent out of answers, as opposed to hasting the Titan. And really, this is one of the more tricky decks to learn all the different lines and stuff, and there's no way I could go into enough detail in this video to kind of cover all those. Just kind of wanted to give you a rough idea of what the deck was like. The different tech that it runs, whether it runs Karn or no Karn, battlements versus Slayer Stronghold. Those are kind of the main things, and then just understanding how the deck does. Functionally, the deck can oftentimes go off on turn 3. Turn 2, in very specific circumstances that usually revolve multiple Amulets of Vigor. And then turn 4, it can consistently kill with Dryad and Primeval Titan, getting a bunch of mana off of Amulet and such. Different kill lines usually involve either a Hasty Titan smacking you for a lot of damage, or Dryad kills usually involve Valakut plus Titan getting you some more Valakuts in play, getting land drops, and then kind of either gunning down your opponent's board, and they just kill you with whatever they have left over if you happen to answer their Titan or Dryad, or, just killing you directly the turn with Dryad with a bunch of land drops, copying a bunch of Valakuts and then just doming you to death. It's primarily what the deck is set up to do. As far as its weak points, like we've already said, counterspells are a problem. Hate cards in particular that are good against it. Blood Moon, Magus of the Moon. Dive Down, keeping creatures from having ETB abilities. The other card that used to play was Ashiok Dreamrender. The not being able to search the library can be quite problematic. Torpor Orb is another card that saw some play a long time ago. Mainly shuts down Titan and Cultivator Colossus. Doesn't really have much of an effect on Dryad, but, also shuts down Arboreal Grazer. So a lot of it just depends on what you're trying to do with the deck, how your deck is set up to fight Titan. As far as Titan's good matchups, Burn, Hammer Time, Dredge, most of the mid-range decks happen to be very good decks. As far as the decks that it struggles against, decks with counterspells plus pressure, decks with a bunch of interaction like the Blue-White X control decks have been tricky over time, especially with the addition of Solitude and such. If they have any type of like land-based counter and whatnot, finding your Cavern of Souls becomes very important in those matchups. You're chaining your Titans with your Teleria Wests, drawing a bunch of cards with either Cultivator Colossus or Tireless Tracker. And then the other decks that can be tricky used to be the creature combo decks. So now it would be represented by Yogg, just because this deck doesn't interact with a whole lot with what those decks are doing. Just kind of became two ships passing the night kind of thing, and they oftentimes were a little bit faster than the Amulet Titan as far as what strategies they were trying to execute. Then obviously the non-creature-based combo decks could also be tricky. Decks like Storm, decks like Neoform Combo. The old Infect decks used to be difficult because this deck, once again, doesn't interact particularly well with creatures in that regard. The reason why it's better against Hammer Time is because the plethora of anti-artifact enchantment cards that it already plays, and the fact that you can gun down a lot of their creatures with Valakuts and stuff, becoming this kind of pseudo-ramp control deck. But, You know, Amulet's in a very interesting place in the meta. It kind of rises and falls with what's at the top of the meta. Obviously, you need to learn how to play around. Is it Murktide being probably the toughest tier 1 matchup? Another deck that can give you some fits is Living End, because, you know, being able to wipe your board and get their own stuff back. Now, while this deck does have some ability to recur, you know, Bojuka Bogs and such against decks like that, or, you know, bring in Endurances, you're still facing the problem of, you know, if you Bojuka Bog during their turn, you know, they can just end step, cycle a couple of cards, then untap and, like, wrath away your board while also putting pressure into play. So that has historically been a tricky matchup for this deck. Even the Jund Living End version would be a little bit tricky because they would often play things like Blood Moon and such, which would kind of play into whatever things. Or it would also play like Fulminator Mages to blow up your lands, setting you back. And then one final thing to be aware of is when you're playing Summoner's Pact, be mindful of how you're going to pay for it the following turn if you're not having to kill your opponent. So, you know, make sure you're fetching enough green sources that if your opponent happens to kill your Titan or your Dryad, that you still have the ability to pay for your pack the following turn. Otherwise, you can lose that. Other cards this deck used to play Slaughter Pact and Pact Negation. Now, there's simply not really room in it to play, as it's gotten a lot of other tools and stuff over time that kind of answered a lot of what those cards used to answer. But it's pretty much a quick rundown on Amulet Titan, what the deck does, different things that it plays to. You would really need to check out Francisco. And there are some other things. House plays House of Mana. Someone's done a lot of work with this. There's a lot of articles and videos and stuff out there about how to actually play the deck. This is more of like understanding how the deck functions and kind of the key cards as far as like what this deck's trying to execute and what's some good and bad matchups. But overall, deck is very tricky to play, has a lot of interesting lines. If you tend to like puzzles, this might be the magic deck for you. As one of the Sam Black's friend that was a runner-up at the Pro Tour mentioned that he played this deck because basically he didn't like playing Magic, he liked solving puzzles. This deck is very much a solving puzzle deck, you know, learning all these different lines with Primeval Titan, Dryad, how many amulets you have, and amulets stacking, you know, getting 2, 3, 4 amulets in play can actually be quite devastating. So there's a lot of things to learn with this deck. This is just kind of a primer to give you an idea of what the deck's about, but hopefully I did a good enough explanation here. As always, this has been John for MTG Nexus. Let me know what deck you might like to see us cover next, and hope to see you for the next video.